Welcome to Clandestine Cases, where captivating stories and mysteries come to life. Make sure to subscribe and join us on this exciting journey of suspense and intrigue. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can improve our content. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your feedback means a lot to us. Miss Marple and the Girl Who Couldn't Speak. Chapter 1. A Knock at the Garden Gate. It was a warm and gentle morning in St. Mary Mead. The sun filtered softly through the branches of the old elm tree by the fence, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of gold. Birds flitted between hedges, and the faint scent of honeysuckle lingered in the air. Miss Marple, wearing her faded gardening hat and a pair of worn gloves, was in her back garden, carefully watering her delphiniums. Her hands, though age-lined, moved with precision and care, as though each petal mattered. Beside the border of rose bushes, her maid Florence was tugging out weeds with quiet determination. The only sounds were the trickle of water from the watering can and the occasional rustle of a passing breeze. Florence glanced up from the earth and tilted her head. "Is something the matter, Miss Marple? You seem a touch preoccupied this morning." Miss Marple paused, looking up from a cluster of pale yellow daisies. There was a slight crease between her brows, and the corners of her mouth were drawn in thought. "It's Raymond," she said after a moment. "His birthday is coming up next week, and I haven't the faintest idea what to gift him." Florence smiled faintly. "Well now, what sort of things does Mr. Raymond like?" Miss Marple gave a small, nostalgic chuckle. "When he was a boy, it was always cars, jeeps, and all manner of noisy little toys. He had a passion for engines, even built a small wind-up model of a lorry once, entirely from tin and string. But that was years ago. Now," she sighed, "he's grown rather fond of traveling. Foreign lands, rail journeys, riverboats are all very exciting, I imagine." Florence stirred and brushed the soil from her knees. "Why don't you give him a diary? A proper leather-bound one, the kind you can take on trips. He could jot down places he visits, things he sees." Miss Marple looked up, her expression brightening. "A diary? Yes, of course. That's an excellent idea, Florence. Practical, thoughtful, and entirely Raymond. Yes, I shall give him a diary this year." As if on cue to disturb the peaceful domestic scene, a sharp knock echoed from the front gate. Florence looked towards the sound, then wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll go, shall I?" "Do please," Miss Marple replied, placing the watering can gently by the flower bed. Florence made her way round to the front of the cottage. Through the picket fence stood a thin, slightly nervous-looking young man, perhaps in his early 20s. His clothes were rumpled, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Yes?" Florence asked, peering through the gate. "I'd like to see Miss Marple, please," the boy said, his voice steady but cautious. Florence opened the gate halfway and regarded him with mild suspicion. "And you are?" "Edward," he said. "George's son. We live just down the lane. My father runs the laundry." Florence hesitated a moment, then turned back into the garden. "Miss Marple, there's a young man here, Edward, he says, George's son." Miss Marple emerged from behind the climbing clematis, her hands still gloved, a light frown on her face. She approached the gate with calm curiosity. "Edward, is it?" she said, eyeing the boy closely. "Ah, yes, you're the one who used to steal sweets from the tuck shop at school, weren't you? And didn't your father throw you out for stealing his watch?" Edward shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, ma'am, that was me." Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly, her gaze sharp beneath the softness of her tone. "I hear you've not exactly turned over a new leaf. Still at it, are you?" Edward flushed. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but that's not why I came. I need your help." She raised her brows. Go on. Edward looked around nervously as if expecting someone to be eavesdropping. The guest house, the one just outside the village near the old wood. I went there the other night to steal something. I assumed as much, Miss Marple murmured dryly. I didn't mean to get caught up in anything, he said quickly. It was late. I crept in through the kitchen window. It was pitch dark inside. I was just feeling my way around when I tripped on something. I hit the floor hard and dropped my torch. When I turned it on, there was blood all over the floor and a woman lying there, dead. Miss Marple didn't react immediately. She stood very still, absorbing every word. I panicked, Edward went on. I didn't touch anything, I swear, but I must have left my footprints in the blood. I just ran. But if someone finds the body and those prints, they'll think I did it. I didn't, Miss Marple. I didn't kill her. His voice cracked. Please help me. I'll never steal again. I mean it. Just, please. For a long moment, the garden was silent. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained thoughtful. The guest house. That would be Hallister's place, wouldn't it? She said finally. A curious man, always kept himself to himself. Edward nodded quickly. Yes, that one. Well, she said, removing her gardening hat, you've certainly got yourself into a mess, but I suppose it's fortunate you came to me rather than hiding in a hedge. You'll help me? I shall look into it, she replied briskly. Though don't mistake this for absolution. You've got a great deal to prove, Edward. Yes, Miss Marple, I understand. She turned back towards the garden path, already lost in thought. Now tell me exactly what time this happened and what you saw before you ran. Every detail. We must start somewhere after all. And so began, quietly and without fanfare, another of Miss Marple's inquiries, one sparked not by a letter or village rumour, but by a boy with blood on his boots and a conscience finally stirring to life. Chapter 2. A Visit to the Station. Miss Marple turned to Edward with a quiet resolve. Then the first thing we must do, she said firmly, is go directly to the police station. Edward, pale and visibly anxious, nodded. The walk to the station was brisk but tense. Miss Marple didn't speak, and Edward seemed too absorbed in his own worry to attempt conversation. The streets of St. Mary Mead, usually so inviting and cheerful in the mid-morning light, felt oddly silent. Even the bird song seemed distant. When they arrived at the station, the constable on duty gave Miss Marple a respectful nod and showed her through to the main office, where Inspector Arthur sat at a desk surrounded by stacks of papers and an air of fatigue. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Edward. Well, well, he said, rising from his chair. We've been looking for you for quite some time, Edward. You've got quite the list against your name. Petty theft, trespassing, and at least 2 active files. Edward shrank back slightly, but Miss Marple held up a hand calmly. Inspector Arthur, if I may, she said, her voice composed but insistent. I've brought Edward here because I believe he's found himself in something far more serious than any of his usual mischief. The inspector folded his arms. Go on, Miss Marple. She recounted the story with characteristic clarity. She explained how Edward had come to her garden in a state of distress, how he had admitted to attempting a theft at the guest house on the edge of the village, and how, instead of valuables, he had stumbled across a gruesome scene. A woman's lifeless body surrounded by blood. Inspector Arthur listened without interrupting, though the crease between his brows deepened as the tale went on. When Miss Marple finished, he turned his gaze on Edward. And you expect me to believe this? I do, Miss Marple said simply. Edward has made mistakes, no one denies that. But I believe him when he says he didn't commit this crime. He came to me for help, That at the very least ought to earn him a hearing. The inspector was quiet for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Miss Marple, if it were anyone else speaking, I'd have dismissed it outright. But given your record, I'll allow him a little time. That doesn't mean he escapes justice for his past. He'll still need to answer for those. Agreed, Miss Marple said. Now, before we go tearing through that guest house, I believe we should speak to its owner. His name is Alistair. I'd prefer he be present during any investigation. Inspector Arthur gave a short nod to the constable. Bring in Alistair. He's the one who lets the guest house near the wood. Tell him it's urgent. Roughly half an hour later, Alistair arrived at the station, looking puzzled and slightly out of breath. He was a tall man with thinning hair, a sun-worn face, and a habit of rubbing his hands together when nervous. "What's this all about?" he asked, as he stepped into the room. "Why have I been caught here?" Inspector Arthur gestured to Edward. "This young man broke into your guest house, Alistair. He says he found a woman's body there. We intend to investigate immediately. Do you have the keys to the property?" Alistair looked startled, his brows lifting. "A dead body? No one's mentioned anything to me." He fumbled in his coat pocket and produced a set of keys. "Yes, I have them, but that place has been let for the past few months. I don't go there unless there's maintenance or changeover." "To whom was it let?" the inspector asked, taking the keys from him. "A man named Charles," Alistair replied. "He moved in with his wife and little daughter about 2, maybe 3 months ago. Quiet fellow, paid on time, never any complaints. And where is he now?" And a shadow crossed Alistair's face. "He passed away just last week. Road accident. Tragic business. Now it's just the wife and child staying there. They're supposed to move out at the end of the month." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes ever so slightly. "And the wife? What do you know of her?" "Not much," Alistair admitted. "She kept to herself. Friendly enough, but not the sort to gossip or wander the village. Name's Margaret, I think. Their daughter's around 5 or 6. Inspector Arthur looked at Miss Marple, who was already pulling on her gloves. "Well then," he said, "we've a guest house to visit." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "If there truly is a body, we must find it. And if Edward's telling the truth, then that poor woman deserves far more than being left behind in silence." As they prepared to leave the station, Edward lingered near the doorway, watching the proceedings unfold with an odd mix of guilt and hope. For the first time in a long while, someone believed him. Not just anyone, but Miss Marple herself. Outside, the clouds were beginning to gather in the sky. The village rooftop stood quiet under the weight of something that hadn't quite happened yet. A storm was coming, not of wind or rain, but of truth, buried secrets, and justice, waiting in the shadows of a guest house. Chapter 3. The silence in the cupboard. The sky above St. Mary Mead had begun to turn overcast, the soft clouds thickening, as Miss Marple, Inspector Arthur, his team, Edward, and Alistair, approached the ivy-covered guest house at the village's edge. The house, once a cheerful countryside retreat, now stood solemn and still, its windows like unblinking eyes and its stone steps slightly weathered, as though they too had been holding their breath. Miss Marple paused by the gate, peering up at the second floor. "You're quite sure it was near the stairs?" she asked, her voice steady but gentle. Edward nodded, pointing to the narrow timbered structure that led up from the hallway. "Yes, right by the first-floor landing. I tripped in the dark and landed next to her." Inspector Arthur gestured for 2 officers to take the lead. The front door creaked as it opened, revealing the familiar mustiness of an unused country house. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, disturbed only by their movements. The wooden floor creaked faintly beneath their feet. They climbed the staircase with caution, each step bringing a sharper edge of anticipation. Near the landing, the group came to a sudden stop. There she was, The woman lay twisted at the base of the stairs, her head resting against the wall, one arm bent unnaturally across her chest. Her dress, cream with a faded blue floral print, was stained deeply with blood. Her hair, auburn and thick, was matted across her face. There was no doubt. She had been dead for some time. Alistair stepped forward, his face pale. "That's her," he said quietly. "Charles's wife." Miss Marple knelt beside the body with a careful grace that defied her age. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. Scattered across the floor near the woman's outstretched hand were several pieces of paper, creased and slightly torn. She reached for one and turned it over. Children's drawings, scribbled in crayon, purple suns, stick figures with outstretched arms, a large house with smoke curling from the chimney. "These belong to the little girl," she murmured, holding the sheet delicately. "She must have been nearby when this happened, which means she could still be somewhere inside, or taken." Inspector Arthur's jaw tightened. "We search every room, top to bottom, no exceptions." While the inspector issued instructions to his officers, Miss Marple quietly gathered the crumpled drawings and tucked them into her handbag. She rose to her feet and headed upstairs alone, her footsteps as silent as they were deliberate. The corridor above was narrow, its floorboards warped slightly with age. Rooms opened off both sides, their doors slightly ajar, as if hesitant to reveal their secrets. She moved carefully, glancing into each space, bedroom, study, box room, until she reached the last door at the end of the hall. Inside was a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a soft yellow. A small bed with an unmade quilt stood beneath the window. Toys were scattered on the floor, a wooden duck with wheels, a teddy bear missing an eye, a tea set with a cracked saucer. The sense of abandonment was palpable, and something about the stillness unsettled even Miss Marple. She scanned the room slowly, then stepped toward the wardrobe. Her hand hesitated for just a moment on the handle before pulling it open. Inside, nestled against the far corner, was the girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her tiny knees were tucked to her chest, and her arms were wrapped tightly around them. Her blonde hair hung across her face, and her wide, terrified eyes stared at Miss Marple without blinking. She didn't move, didn't flinch, only breathed, quick, shallow breaths that made her whole frame quiver. Miss Marple crouched down and softened her voice to a near whisper. "My dear, it's quite all right. You're safe now." The girl said nothing. "I'm Miss Marple. We're here to help." Still no response. Miss Marple slowly reached into her handbag and pulled out one of the drawings. She held it up gently. "Is this yours?" she asked, her tone warm and reassuring. "It's rather good, a very happy son you've drawn." The girl didn't nod, didn't reach for the picture. She remained frozen, her lips slightly parted, her eyes glassy. Miss Marple drew in a quiet breath. "She's either too frightened or cannot speak," she murmured, mostly to herself. "This isn't the time to press her." Just then, Inspector Arthur stepped into the room, his eyes widening as he saw the child. "Good heavens, she's here?" "She's unharmed but in shock," Miss Marple said, standing slowly. "We'll need a doctor and someone experienced with children. For now, she needs calm and no questions." Arthur nodded solemnly. "We'll arrange it." As he left to make the necessary calls, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room once more. On a small table by the bed lay a stack of documents, half concealed beneath a storybook. She lifted them carefully. Among them she found a marriage certificate, issued by the village church. It named Charles Wentham as the groom and Mary Wentham as the bride. The handwriting was faded but clear. "So, The woman was definitely Mary. She slipped the certificate into her handbag as well and returned downstairs where Alistair was waiting near the front parlour. His face was drawn and weary. "We found the girl," Miss Marple informed him. "She was hiding in the cupboard upstairs." Alistair looked shocked. "Good heavens, is she, She's shaken but unharmed. Do you recognize her?" "Yes," he said softly. "That's Charles's daughter. I remember when they moved in, always a quiet little thing." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "When you rented the house to Charles, did you collect any personal details? A home address, perhaps?" "Yes, I always do," he replied. "I took down his previous address, just in case." "May I have it?" Alistair nodded and retrieved it from his wallet, a folded sheet of paper worn at the corners. Miss Marple read the address, then handed it to Inspector Arthur. "We must visit this place," she said. "There may be something there that explains this tragedy." Arthur agreed at once. "We'll leave now. Constable, have the body taken to the hospital for post-mortem and take Edward back to the station for further questioning." Alistair hesitated. "I should stay here and start cleaning up. This place is a mess." Miss Marple's voice sharpened slightly. "No, Mr. Alistair, you won't touch a thing. This house may still hold vital evidence. Nothing is to be disturbed." Arthur gave a single nod. "This property is now under police control. Until further notice, no one enters or exits without permission." The group gathered outside once more, the afternoon sun now dimmed by a canopy of grey clouds. The weight of what they had uncovered clung to them as they climbed into the police vehicle. Behind them, the guest house stood quiet again, its secrets half revealed, its shadows stretching across the garden path like a silent witness. But Miss Marple, with her eyes focused ahead, already knew the path forward was narrowing. She didn't yet have the whole picture, but pieces were beginning to form. And something in her quiet, thoughtful expression said that the mystery wouldn't remain unsolved for long. Chapter 4. The Woman No One Knew. The ride to Charles Wentham's former residence was a quiet one. Miss Marple sat in the back of the police vehicle with the little girl curled beside her, holding tightly to a corner of Miss Marple's shawl. The child had not spoken a single word, but she hadn't resisted either. There was something trusting in the way she followed Miss Marple, something fragile and solemn. Inspector Arthur, seated in the front, occasionally glanced back through the mirror, his expression thoughtful. "We're in deep waters now," he muttered, "and too many people claiming to know nothing." The house itself was a modest stone structure at the edge of the village, with roses blooming unevenly along the fence and curtains drawn in every window. It had the air of a place that was lived in but not openly shared. They were greeted at the door by a middle-aged woman with a lined face and tired eyes. "Yes?" she asked warily. "Miss Marple and Inspector Arthur to see the family," Arthur replied politely, showing his badge. The woman stepped back. "Come in." Inside, the house had a warm but worn quality to it. Floral wallpaper slightly faded, wooden furniture scuffed with use. Within minutes, Miss Marple had gathered everyone into the sitting room. There were 5 of them: Annie, Charles's elderly mother with stiff posture and a guarded gaze; Lucas, his younger brother, a stout man with a square jaw and cautious manner; Dorothy, Lucas's quiet wife, who clutched a tea towel with nervous hands; Amelia, their teenage daughter, who stood at the door, awkward and uncertain; and Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, the little girl holding her hand. "I understand Charles died in a road accident recently. A terrible loss, and I offer my condolences." The room murmured its thanks, the atmosphere already tense. "But I must share something more," Miss Marple continued. Earlier today, a woman's body was discovered at the guest house where Charles had been staying. She was found near the staircase, dead. The family reacted immediately. That's impossible, Lucas exclaimed. Charles's wife, Lily, is right here. Miss Marple turned to Lily and nodded. Yes, she is. Which leads us to a very serious question. If Lily is here, then who was the woman living with Charles at the guest house? No one spoke for a moment. We don't know, Lucas said finally. We had no idea he was living with anyone else. Inspector Arthur's voice was firm. Surely someone must have known your family. There were things Charles didn't tell us, Annie said stiffly. He became more distant these last few years. Miss Marple opened her handbag and carefully removed the folded marriage certificate. The woman's name was Mary. She wasn't a stranger. She was his wife. Gasps and uneasy shuffles followed as Miss Marple held out the document. I found this during my search of the guest house. It is a legal marriage certificate. Charles Wentham and Mary Denning married at the parish church 7 years ago. A heavy silence fell. Then Dorothy spoke, her voice thin. He never mentioned her, not even once. Lucas shook his head. None of us had a clue. But Lily, who had remained silent until now, stood slowly. Her eyes didn't move from the little girl's face. I knew, she said, her voice calm but heavy. He told me. Everyone turned to look at her. Even Amelia, usually aloof, looked startled. You knew about Mary? Asked Annie, incredulous. Yes, Lily said. We couldn't have children. It was something Charles wanted more than anything. 7 years ago, he told me he was going to marry another woman. I agreed to stay silent. I thought it would bring him peace. Miss Marple studied her face carefully. But recently he changed his mind. Lily nodded. Yes, just before the accident. He came to me, conflicted, angry. He told me he was planning to leave Mary. Why? Inspector Arthur asked. Because she was having an affair, Lily replied. With Alistair, the man who owns the guest house. The name struck the room like a dropped stone in still water. My husband found out, Lily continued. They'd been meeting in secret. There were arguments. He confronted Alistair twice, nearly came to blows. He told me everything but asked me not to say a word. Miss Marple's brows knitted slightly. Why did he decide to move into the guest house then? I think he wanted to see things for himself, Lily said. He never admitted it, but I knew he was watching them. Waiting. Miss Marple and Inspector Arthur exchanged a glance. If what you say is true, the inspector said, then Alistair had motive and opportunity. And possibly the child saw more than she's able or willing to say. Miss Marple added softly, looking down at the little girl, who now sat curled on the edge of a chair, her drawing clutched to her chest. Miss Marple turned back to the room. Thank you all for your honesty. We won't trouble you further, for now. Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. As they walked back to the car, Miss Marple said quietly, We need to speak to Alistair again. There are too many things he hasn't told us, and something tells me he knows more about Mary's death than he let on. Inspector Arthur's jaw tightened. Agreed. Let's pay him a second visit, this time with fewer questions and a more pressure. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but resolute. The truth, as ever, was hiding in plain sight, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 5. The Truth in the Silence. The late afternoon sun cast a muted glow over the village as Miss Marple, Inspector Arthur, and the silent child made their way towards Alistair's home. The little girl walked close to Miss Marple, her small hand clasped tightly in the elderly woman's gloved fingers. She had not spoken since they left Charles's family home, but something in her stillness, her unwavering grip, suggested she was listening to everything. Alistair's house stood at the edge of a winding lane, a well-kept stone cottage with a garden that spoke more of practical upkeep than personal care. The hedge was trimmed, but the flowers were dry, as though no one had remembered to water them. As they reached the gate, a woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Yes?" she asked, eyeing them curiously. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Good afternoon. We're here to speak with your husband, Alistair. Is he home?" "He's in the bath just now," the woman replied. "He won't be long. Do come in and wait." They entered the parlor, a neat, sparsely decorated room with mismatched cushions and the faint scent of lavender polish. The woman offered them tea, which Miss Marple declined with a gentle shake of her head. The little girl sat beside her, still clutching a corner of Miss Marple's shawl. Moments later, Alistair emerged, hair damp and shirt sleeves rolled up. He stopped in the doorway when he saw them, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Miss Marple, Inspector." "We need to speak with you," Miss Marple said at once, her tone calm but unyielding. "Would you prefer we speak in private, or is it all right if your wife remains?" Alistair glanced at his wife, then back at them. "You can say what you like in front of her. I've nothing to hide." Miss Marple didn't hesitate. "We've come to learn that you were involved with Mary, Charles's second wife." Alistair sighed and sat down slowly. "She was after me for quite some time, even while Charles was alive. She would come around the property, find excuses to speak with me, linger longer than necessary." He looked down at his hands, then up again. "But after Charles died, it got worse. She started saying she didn't want to be with him anymore, that she had what she wanted, a child, and was ready to move on. She told me she'd even give me the little girl if I married her." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her eyes fixed gently on him. "I told her no," Alistair continued. "I have a wife. I'm not the sort to leave my family." But Mary, she didn't stop. She said she wanted the farmhouse in her name. She talked about money, land, inheritance. Greedy woman. She said she'd sent a legal notice to Charles's family, demanding a share of the property. "We'll be rich soon," she told me. I told her it would never happen. I wasn't going to be part of her schemes. Inspector Arthur's brows drew together. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" "No," Alistair said. "I didn't want trouble. I tried to keep my distance, but she kept coming back." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Alistair's wife, who had said nothing during the conversation. She sat with her arms folded, face tight with disapproval, but no surprise. "You knew?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I knew enough," the woman replied stiffly. "I saw her around, saw how she looked at him. But I trust my husband. I knew he wouldn't do anything foolish." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Thank you. That will be all for now." They stood, and Alistair followed them to the door. Outside, the village was quiet, and the evening light had taken on the pale tones of early dusk. The little girl, still holding Miss Marple's hand, looked up for the first time since they had arrived at the cottage. She didn't speak, but her eyes met Miss Marple's with something like pleading, something ancient and wounded in a child far too young to carry such weight. As they walked away, Inspector Arthur said, "Well, he certainly gave us motive and character, but no proof." Miss Marple stopped. "Not yet, but the mention of the legal notice that we can follow. If Mary truly intended to claim the property, she would have needed a solicitor, and that solicitor may hold the key to her final days." Arthur nodded. "I can get the list of local firms. We'll start there." They returned to the car, And as the inspector drove, Miss Marple sat quietly in the back, with the little girl leaning against her side. The child had begun to soften, her grip less rigid now, her breathing steadier. Miss Marple stroked her hair once, gently, and the girl didn't flinch. "There's something we're not seeing," Miss Marple said quietly, mostly to herself. Mary was not just desperate, she was determined. A woman doesn't go to the lengths of confronting two households, manipulating a man and filing property claims unless she's quite certain of the outcome. She must have believed something, or someone, would protect her. "You think she was working with someone?" Arthur asked. "Or against someone," Miss Marple murmured. By the time they reached the village, the sun had dipped below the horizon. A cool breeze swept through the narrow lanes, carrying the scent of earth and coming rain. The mystery was deepening, and with it the shadows around Mary's death grew longer and more complex. But Miss Marple, who had seen all manner of secrets unraveled beneath the gentlest of smiles, was patient. She knew the truth always left footprints, even if they were faint. They would follow Mary's trail to the solicitor's office next. And with each step, the answers would draw closer. Chapter 6. The Drawing That Spoke. The light had turned crisp and pale by the time Miss Marple, Inspector Arthur, and the little girl arrived at the courthouse. There was a quiet solemnity about the building, its grey stone steps flanked by rusting railings and flower beds gone untended. The girl clung to Miss Marple's hand without a sound, her steps small and hesitant, her gaze sweeping every corridor as though wary of each corner. Inside, Miss Marple scanned the hallway until her eyes settled on a man in a dark waistcoat, sorting through files behind a cluttered desk. She approached with purposeful calm. "Excuse me," she said gently. "You're Mr. Kendall, are you not? The solicitor?" The man looked up, blinking. "Yes, that's me. My name is Miss Marple," she continued, "and this is Inspector Arthur. I've come to inquire about a legal matter you may have handled recently, on behalf of a woman named Mary Wentham." His expression shifted slightly. Recognition, then wariness. "Yes, I did handle something for her. A property claim, so she instructed you to send a legal notice to Charles Wentham's family, asserting her right to the estate." He nodded. "That's correct. She came to me about 2 weeks before her death. She said she was married to the late Charles Wentham, and that she intended to make a formal claim to the farmhouse he once owned. I reviewed the marriage certificate and documentation she brought. Everything appeared to be in order." "And how was the notice delivered?" Miss Marple asked. "We send such legal documents via our appointed postman, Thomas Brigg. He handles all the official court deliveries." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. "Is he here now?" "He should be," Kendall replied, standing. "He's usually sorting post in the rear office." They made their way through the back corridor, past the low murmur of clerks at work and the dusty scent of aged paper, until they found the man in question. Thomas Brigg, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a woolen cap tucked under his arm, looked up as they entered. "You're Mr. Brigg?" Inspector Arthur asked. "That's me." "Did you deliver a legal notice addressed to the family of Charles Wentham sometime in the past fortnight?" Miss Marple asked, kindly but directly. Brigg nodded without hesitation. I remember that one." "Do you recall who received it?" she asked. He furrowed his brow for a moment, then nodded again. "Yes, I do. It was a woman. Answered the door sharp as anything. I'd seen her before, around the village. Not young, but not old either. She had dark hair, tied up, and wore a navy coat." "Would you recognize her if you saw her again?" the inspector pressed. "Oh, yes," Brigg replied with certainty. "No doubt about it." Just then the little girl, who had been silent throughout the exchange, began tugging insistently on Miss Marple's hand. Not once, but again and again, more urgently, with each pull. Miss Marple knelt down beside her. "What is it, dear?" The girl, her eyes wide and focused, reached into the pocket of her small woolen coat and pulled out a folded page. It was creased at the corners and slightly smudged, but she handed it to Miss Marple with purpose. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing, a child's sketch done in crayon and pencil, with uneven lines and exaggerated features, but it was detailed. It showed a house, Charles's house, and in the foreground, standing beside the gate, was a woman. She wore a long coat, carried what appeared to be a satchel, and had dark hair pulled up high on her head. But what struck Miss Marple most wasn't the figure, it was the face. For a child, the drawing was unusually expressive. The woman's expression had been drawn sharp, the mouth a thin curved line, the eyebrows pointed and angled inward. A scowl. The child hadn't drawn someone friendly. "She saw it," Miss Marple whispered. "What is it?" Arthur asked, looking over her shoulder. Miss Marple turned to the girl. "Sweetheart, did you draw this from memory?" The child didn't speak, but she nodded, once, firmly. Miss Marple straightened and looked at the inspector. "We must go back to Charles's house immediately." The journey back to the Wentham house felt heavier than before. A creeping stillness had settled over the village, the trees lining the road bending ever so slightly in the cold breeze. By the time they reached the front gate, the sky had darkened just enough to lend an ominous quality to the place. Charles's family were all inside: Annie, Lucas, Dorothy, Amelia, and Lily. They gathered once more in the sitting room, uneasy under the growing weight of the investigation. Miss Marple addressed them gently, but firmly. "I have a few more questions, I'm afraid." The family glanced at one another. Lucas spoke up. "We've told you everything we know." "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet but piercing. "A legal notice was sent to this house, issued by Mary Wentham shortly before her death. It was received here, not by any man, but by a woman." A ripple went through the room. "We spoke to the solicitor," Miss Marple continued, "and the postman. Both confirmed the notice was delivered. The postman clearly remembers a woman receiving it, a woman with dark hair and a navy coat." She turned, then unfolded the little girl's sketch and held it out. "This drawing," she said, "was done by Mary's daughter. She saw the person who answered the door that day. She drew her." The room fell utterly silent. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the faces, Annie's pale and drawn, Lucas avoiding her eyes, Dorothy trembling, and finally Lily, whose eyes flicked for the briefest moment toward the drawing, then away. Inspector Arthur stepped forward. "We'd like each of you to account for your whereabouts on the day the notice would have been delivered. I imagine the solicitor's log will confirm the exact date and time." Miss Marple looked at the girl, who had sat down quietly on the sofa, still watching everyone. "She may not speak," Miss Marple said softly, "but she remembers. And she sees more than any of us realize." Chapter 7. A Child's Silent Witness. It was a grey afternoon when Miss Marple and Inspector Arthur returned to the Wentham residence once more. This time the atmosphere was markedly different. The presence of uniformed officers was enough to tilt the balance of any household, but what truly shifted the air was the small, silent figure walking beside Miss Marple, the little girl, her steps light but unhesitating, her fingers curled tightly around the elderly woman's hand. Inspector Arthur moved with purpose, flanked by two constables. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they reached the door. Moments later, Lucas answered, his face pale and tight. "What is it now?" he asked, voice already defensive. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she raised a gentle hand. Please, Mr. Lucas, call everyone into the sitting room. This won't take long, but it is important. Reluctantly, the family gathered again. Annie sat nearest the fireplace in her usual upright position. Lucas and Dorothy remained by the doorway, and Amelia stood further back, arms folded. Lily quietly took a seat near the little girl, who sat close beside Miss Marple, her wide eyes watching every face in the room. Inspector Arthur stood behind Miss Marple as she began. Mrs. Annie Wentham, she said calmly, you told us earlier that you had no knowledge of Mary, no involvement with her affairs, and certainly no contact with any legal matters regarding Charles's property. That's right, Annie said firmly. But that was not the truth, was it? Miss Marple's tone remained light, almost conversational. Mary sent a property claim notice through her solicitor, and that notice was delivered directly to you. Annie's lips pressed into a thin line. I never received anything of the sort. Miss Marple gave a small nod. I thought you might say that. But we've spoken to the postman, the very one who delivered the legal documents. He remembers clearly whom he handed it to. At that moment, one of the constables stepped in, opening the front door behind him. Inspector, he said, the postman's here. Thomas Brick entered, removing his cap respectfully. He glanced around the room, scanning each face. Then his eyes stopped on Annie. That's her, he said clearly, pointing. I gave the notice to that lady. She opened the door herself and took it from my hand. The room fell into a tense, stunned silence. Miss Marple stepped forward and pulled out a folded sheet of paper from her handbag. She unfolded it slowly and held it up. This drawing, she said gently, was made by Mary's daughter. She doesn't speak, but she sees. And she remembers. In her drawing, we see one woman striking another with a stick. And this woman, she paused, raising the sketch a little higher, is wearing a traditional suit and a hat and has curly hair, the same as you were seen wearing the day the notice was delivered, the same as you're wearing now. Annie's hands, which had been clasped tightly in her lap, began to tremble. Her posture stiffened, then faltered. Her eyes fell on the drawing, and for a moment her mouth opened, as if to protest. But no words came. She exhaled shakily and closed her eyes. Yes, she whispered. I did it. The silence in the room grew heavier, filled not with gasps, but the sharp quiet of finality. I killed Mary. Lucas staggered backward. Mother, what are you saying? Annie raised her head slowly. Her eyes no longer burned with defensiveness. They were weary, hollow. She came to take what wasn't hers, she said. Our land, my Charles's land. That woman, she married him in secret, wormed her way into his life just to get her hands on this house, this name, our legacy. And then she had the audacity to send a legal claim, to try and take from us. But why didn't you tell us? Dorothy asked, her voice a whisper. I was trying to protect you all, Annie said. I went to the guest house. I was only going to confront her, but she laughed in my face. Told me she'd make sure the land was hers, and that her daughter would grow up owning everything Charles left behind. Annie's gaze flicked toward the little girl, then away again. I hated her. I hated them both. I saw a stick lying near the fireplace. I picked it up and I struck her. Again and again. I wanted her to be quiet. I didn't want that child to have any part of my son's name. Lucas looked horrified. You tried to harm the child. I looked for her, Annie said quietly. I did. I was in a rage, but she'd hidden somewhere. Later, I realized she couldn't even speak. I thought she wouldn't be able to tell anyone. So I left. She dropped her head into her hands. I just wanted to keep what was ours. That's all I ever wanted. No one spoke. Even Inspector Arthur remained still for a long moment before signaling his officers. Mrs. Annie Wentham, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mary Wentham. As the constables stepped forward to formally caution and escort her, the little girl edged closer to Miss Marple. Miss Marple did not look away as Annie was gently but firmly led from the room. She kept her gaze steady, not out of judgment, but out of quiet recognition. For all that had been lost, Lucas sank into a chair. Dorothy wiped her eyes. Amelia, pale and shaken, moved to comfort her mother. Only Lily remained strangely composed. I always thought there was a storm in this house, she murmured. Now I see where it was hiding. Inspector Arthur turned to Miss Marple. You were right from the beginning. The child saw it all. Miss Marple looked down at the little girl, who now held the drawing protectively to her chest. She couldn't tell us in words, she said softly. But she found a way. Arthur nodded. Will you stay with her? At least for tonight? She'll stay with me, Miss Marple replied. For as long as she needs to. They stepped outside into the quiet evening. The sky had begun to clear, soft bands of orange light glowing beyond the rooftops. A breeze passed through the hedges, cool and gentle, as if the village had finally exhaled. The little girl took Miss Marple's hand again. Justice, it seemed, had found its way, through silence, memory, and the truth sketched by a child's hand. Epilogue. Tea, letters, and a quiet future. A week had passed since the truth had come to light at the Wentham house. The newspapers had reported the story with a combination of reverence and quiet shock. Elderly matriarch arrested in village murder, read one headline. Another had dubbed it the silence that spoke. But in St. Mary Mead, the pace of life remained mostly unchanged. The grocer still opened at 7 sharp. Children still walked to school in neat lines. And in a small, ivy-framed cottage near the edge of the village, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room, pouring tea into 2 cups, one china thin and painted with forget-me-nots, the other slightly sturdier, more suited to smaller hands. The little girl, Mary's daughter, sat quietly across from her, watching the steam curl upward. She had yet to speak, but there had been changes. She now slept without fear, ate without coaxing, and had even taken to drawing again, less urgently, less darkly. Her sketches had turned to gardens, birds, and people with faces that smiled. Miss Marple had made arrangements, of course. The child would be placed in proper care soon enough. The authorities were still tracing Mary's distant relatives, if any remained. But for now she remained in the safety of the cottage, with Miss Marple reading her bedtime stories and folding her laundry into neat piles. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," Miss Marple called. Inspector Arthur stepped inside, carrying his hat under one arm and a brown folder under the other. He greeted the child with a nod and then sat beside the fireplace. "She's looking better," he observed. "She is," Miss Marple agreed, passing him a cup of tea. "She hasn't said a word, but her eyes are quieter now, less haunted." The inspector opened the folders slowly. "Thought I'd bring you the final report. It's all official now. Annie Wentham's confession matches the forensics. The blood on the stick, the blunt force wounds, they all align. There's no doubt she killed Mary." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And the girl?" "No further threats," he said. "She'll be placed with a family in the county, one with experience in emotional care. Though I must say, I think she's grown rather attached to you." Miss Marple smiled, the faintest trace of emotion flickering behind her usual composure. "We found a rhythm, she and I. There's something to be said for quiet companionship." Arthur sipped his tea, then leaned back. "You'd hope The drawing she made, the one that broke the case wide open, it's going to be used in training. They want to teach detectives to look beyond words, to listen with more than their ears. Miss Marple's expression warmed. A child's truth is often clearer than an adult's reason. It only needed someone to see it. They sat in silence for a moment. The clock ticked softly. Outside, a robin sang somewhere near the hedgerow. Arthur cleared his throat. There's still something that troubles me. Oh. He looked over at the child. What if she hadn't drawn it? What if we'd never known? Miss Marple's gaze moved to the sketch, pinned to the sideboard, a simple crayon drawing of a cottage and garden, and two women seated on a bench with a teacup between them. Then the truth would still be there, she said softly. Waiting. That's the nature of it. Truth doesn't vanish. It waits for someone to notice. Arthur stood, brushing the crumbs from his jacket. You'll let me know if you need anything? I will, she replied. After he left, Miss Marple returned to the tea tray and refilled the child's cup. The girl took it without a word and drank quietly. Her eyes fixed on the window where the late afternoon sun spilled across the garden path. Miss Marple followed her gaze. There were tulips sprouting beneath the fence and a small robin pecking at breadcrumbs on the stone ledge. The world, it seemed, had already begun to heal. She looked down at the girl and placed a hand gently over hers. We'll go for a walk soon, she said. There's a lovely tree at the edge of the wood. Perfect for sitting under. The girl didn't speak, but she smiled, and that for now was enough.